The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights will come to order. I want to note that a quorum is present, and pursuant to the notice, we are holding a hearing highlighting elections in Africa. And I want to welcome all the members on both sides of the aisle to our first subcommittee hearing. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate immediate noise. I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. This hearing comes in the aftermath of a contentious period of democracy in the U.S. that elevated into an election period marred by the abuse of executive power, voter suppression tactics, misinformation about COVID-19, and even an attack on the Capitol in an attempt to delay the peaceful transfer of power. What happened in the U.S. over the last year is similar to what U.S. officials and international observers have said about many elections around the world, including Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. What is different, of course, is that in the United States, our democracy is still strong, and even after a disruption, we were able to continue to the peaceful transfer of power. As we try to process and reconcile the U.S. issues, we also recognize the need for a greater perspective on how to engage more meaningfully during election cycles with African partners who are in the process of building and strengthening their democracies while facing specific country challenges, including entrenched leadership, economic hardship, civil war, terrorism, humanitarian crisis, and now, of course, COVID-19. Our subject is Africa today. There are positive examples to report. There are free and fair elections and credible elections in many African countries, such as Cape Verde, Ghana, Botswana, South Africa, and most recently in Niger. So while we are here today to look at countries that struggle with free, fair, and credible elections, I would like our witnesses to elaborate on successful elections as well. This year, the continent is scheduled to hold 13 presidential or general elections. We are watching these elections closely to listen and learn about areas where we can assist in promoting democratic societies. Recognizing that elections are a snapshot in time, we can use their conduct, outcome, and post-election events as a measure of democratic strength. I believe democratic governance is a shared value between the United States and Africa, and Afrobarometer confirms this with its study findings that 7 out of 10 Africans aspire to live under democratic governance. Traditionally, U.S. policy toward Africa has focused on development assistance, humanitarian aid, and crisis response. Without withdrawing that crucial support, we seek to expand our focus to mutually beneficial partnerships that build commercial relationships, generate resources to mitigate the impact of climate change, enhance the livelihoods of women, youth, and the disadvantaged, and strengthen efforts on peace and security. To effectively push the latter, we need credible leaders in Africa who are committed to democratic governance and know the importance of free, fair, transparent, and credible elections. We need to have a watchful eye on countries with armed conflicts as they prepare for upcoming elections, including Chad, Ethiopia, Libya, Niger, and Somalia, and their ability to hold free, fair, and credible elections given the military and political turmoil. We're particularly watchful of the fragility in the Horn of Africa, which is volatile and facing humanitarian crisis. Although Somalia postponed its election plan for February 8th, I agree with former U.S. Ambassador to Somalia, David Yamamoto, that the election should go forward as soon as possible to prevent backlash and increase instability in the country and the region. Also in the Horn, Ethiopia has elections scheduled in June. The country is extremely fragile as it simultaneously manages first-time multi-party voting, conflict in the Tigray region, and a humanitarian crisis. Although I applauded the initial efforts of the country to advance democracy, I am increasingly concerned by arrests, internet blackouts, hate speech, and other undemocratic actions currently going on and responsible to the Tigray crisis, as I noted in HRES 1183. Given the connection with the region, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Djibouti will be affected by instability in Somalia or Ethiopia. I remain concerned about the situation, and I seek the advice of the witnesses on how best to contribute to the conduct of credible elections in these tense and complex situations. Finally, we must also be concerned about COVID-19. As in our own elections, we've seen other governments, including Tanzania, Guinea, and Uganda, use disinformation or COVID-19 mitigation as a means to suppress voting and voter turnout. On the positive side, Nigeria widely publicized its COVID-19 policy framework, increasing transparency for interested parties, while the Central Republic of Africa dedicated poll workers to enforce COVID-19 mitigation measures. Now that we know the spread of the disease can be mitigated through personal protection equipment, sanitizing, and social distancing, we must ensure governments don't use the pandemic as an excuse to allow discredited elections. Finally, my colleagues and I are interested in hearing recommendations from the witnesses regarding legislative fixes to strengthen democracies in Africa. I strongly believe now is the time to engage Africa through partnerships that create mutually beneficial outcomes. I believe the engagement has to be more thoughtful and innovative than previous approaches. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in this important hearing, and the committee is looking forward to hearing your recommendations on how to strengthen the electoral process and improve democracy across the region. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Bass, and for again holding a hearing on a very important topic, elections in Africa, which follows and builds upon our hearing in September of last year on democratic backsliding in Africa. I think all of us who have been engaged with Africa these past decades have been disturbed by the retreat of democracy through much of sub-Saharan Africa. At last year's hearing, I cited the annual report put out by the Economist Intelligence Unit, showing how democracy has been receding through 2019. This year's report is worse, with democracy now ebbing to its lowest point since 2006. Only Mauritius ranks in the full democracy category per the EIU, and even it has slipped somewhat. More than half the countries of sub-Saharan Africa are now designated as having, quote, authoritarian regimes. What I fear when we discuss the issue of African elections is that we are reverting back to the old one person, one vote, one time conundrum, which plagued Africa during its first dance of freedom post-colonial era. Look, for example, at two countries, Benin and Tanzania, who once were headed by presidents who were true Democrats, committed to the peaceful transition of power. I recall sitting down with President Abani Yali, bowing our heads in prayer during one of his visits to the United States. There was a leader who was committed to public service and the integrity of electoral democracy. When he willingly stepped down in 2016, Benin was becoming a democratic model for Africa. Sadly, since then, under Patrice Talon, democracy has simply atrophied. It has not just simply atrophied, it has regressed substantially. Ditto for Tanzania. President Kikwente was another Democrat who, after serving the allotted 2 terms per the Constitution, stepped down. His successor, John Magufuli, is cut from the very different cloth, winning re-election last year in a purported landslide that was marred by allegation of significant voter fraud. So I do fear we are returning to that one person, one vote, one time. And whereas the post-colonial era, beginning with Ghana's independence in 1957, was characterized by ideological competition with the Soviet Union, which overshadows a fealty to democratic ideals. Today, we again see outside actors subverting democracy and elections throughout Africa, most notably China. I also think we should look critically at how our shortcomings have contributed to this democratic deficit. We saw under President George W. Bush, whose PEPFAR initiative did so much to transform and save the lives of so many Africans, a cultural personal relationship with African leaders, such as President Kikwente, and thus a very one-on-one encouragement of the need to respect elections. This was replaced under both President Obama and President Trump with a certain aloofness towards Africa. One hopes that President Biden's past affinity for working with them for personal relationships and encouragement are important, and hopefully we can reignite those friendships. I hope that our witnesses, especially Mvemba Dizolele, who is an expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo, will address what I characterize as a debacle of a presidential election which took place in the DRC in 2018. In that election, it was quite obvious to independent observers that the declared winner, Tshisekedi, received less votes than Martin Fayulu. Yet because of the corrupt bargain between outgoing strongman Joseph Kabila, the Constitutional Court, which was handpicked by Kabila, declared the winner. Surprisingly and troubling, our State Department then issued a statement that said the United States welcomes the Congolese Constitutional Court certification of Tshisekedi as the next president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was apparently driven by a handful of diplomats, including our ambassador, against an interagency consensus view. Specifically, I'd like to hear your appraisal of the State Department's welcoming message and how the message it sent was received in the region. I would also like to close on a positive note, however, and focus on a place where electoral democracy appears to be advancing, and that would be Somaliland region of Somalia. Despite lacking official recognition, Somaliland is a de facto autonomous and self-governing unit. It has scheduled parliamentary and local elections for May 31st of this year, following a transparent and inclusive voter registration between 2020 and January 2021, per a statement issued by Denmark, the European Union, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States. The election between the governing unity development of the Kulmiye party and two opposition parties, Justice and Welfare included, looks like it will be robustly contested. Other important aspect is it looks like partisan affiliation is transcending clan affiliation in that region. Unfortunately, it does not look like our government is providing any financial support to the election process, unlike the EU, the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Taiwan. And perhaps witnesses from NDI and IRI can clarify whether they will be sending election observers to Somaliland. It is my hope that Somaliland can point the way back to electoral democracy, one person, one vote, but not just one time. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. And now I would like to introduce our witnesses. And let me just say to our witnesses, you have turned in your comments in full, and I would like to ask that you summarize your statements in 5 minutes, and you will notice on the screen a clock for 5 minutes. And so I will hit the gavel at about 30 seconds and ask you to wrap up. We want to do this to make sure that everybody on the committee has an opportunity to ask their questions. We know we have an impending vote that is, the guesstimate is 11:45, and I am going to recommend that we continue this hearing through the vote process, and that we all take turns in our groups and vote, and then please come back. We won't be able to recess the hearing since our vote series take so long. So our first witness is Dr. Elusia Ordu, a senior fellow and director of the Africa Growth Initiative in the Global Economy and Development Program. He was previously vice president at the African Development Bank. Before his appointment as vice president, he worked at the World Bank for over 22 years and served in various leadership and managerial capacities. He is a member of the board of directors of the Partnership for Transparency Fund, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit entity that builds capacity of civil society organizations to fight corruption, and holds a Ph.D. in economics from the Sussex University. Our second witness is Aude Darnal, an associate director at the Atlantic Council's New American Engagement Initiative, where her work focuses on the critical analysis and understanding of armed conflicts and of the humanitarian development peace nexus, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. She has experience in strategic communication and project management thanks to her work in NGOs, think tanks, and international organizations in Senegal and in the US. Ms. Darnal holds a Master's of Science in Conflict Studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a BA in International Relations and International Law from the University of Quebec in Montreal. Mr. Dickson Omondi is Regional Director for the Southern and East Africa at the NDI, National Democratic Institute. He has over 20 years of experience in political party strengthening, legislative development, advancing electoral integrity, and civil society development work. He is a board member of the Carolina for Kibera, an international NGO that works to catalyze positive change through healthcare, education, and girl empowerment in Kenya. He graduated with a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Nairobi and is a member of the International Commission of Jurists, Kenya chapter. Mr. Mvemba Dizolele is a senior advisor for Africa at the International Republican Institute. Formerly, he was a distinguished visiting fellow and national fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. He was a grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and covered the 2006 election in the DRC, where he was embedded with the UN Peacekeepers District and South Kivu Province as a reporter. I would now like to ask our first witness to provide testimony in 5 minutes. Dr. Ordu.
Chairman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, honorable members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to address election integrity in Africa. At the Brookings Institution, as many of you may know, we dedicate a chapter annually to our flagship report, and that report is the Foresight Africa. And we dedicate that chapter to democracy and good governance. We just launched this year's last month. These underpin achievements in economic growth and human development. I'm very encouraged that the US takes a closer look at elections and governance in Africa. First, do permit me to share with you some winds of change exemplifying a newfound solidarity on the African continent. At a time when globalization is under threat, African nations have been intentional in pursuing collaboration. This newfound solidarity is different from anything we've known before. Take, for example, the 2017 establishment of the Africa CDC, and of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area launched in January this year. These efforts are manifestations of Africa's long-held aspirations articulated in the AU's Agenda 2063. The building blocks of the African Continental Free Trade Areas are 8 regional communities, and these communities with the AU apply Africa's solutions to Africa's problems. They support peacekeeping, they mediate in election disputes, and they send observers to monitor elections. ECOWAS, for example, in West Africa, we all know, participated actively in Ghana in 2008, in Guinea 2010, and Liberia in 2011. Despite this success, regional economic communities remain limited in the arena. So what is the state of Africa's elections today? Progress might seem limited if we judge these elections through the prisms of the Western world, because history tells us, as Chairwoman Bass mentioned, that Africa has become more democratic if we take a 30-year time horizon. Why do I say that? The days of coups and counter-coups have gone. Most leaders have left office peacefully. Multi-party elections have become the norm. Are these perfect? Not yet, but there is momentum. Opposition parties are making progress. Politics is becoming more competitive. More women than ever before are winning electoral offices. 1 in 4 congresspersons in Africa is a woman. And in some countries, the ratio is higher. And very, very interestingly, youths are becoming more politically active on the African continent. And this augurs well because, as we all know, a majority of Africans are under the age of 25. But democracy remains a work in progress at best on the African continent. Why do I say that? there are huge entry barriers to run for electoral office in the African continent. Here in the US, a congresswoman, a congressman is assessed by the laws they pass. On the African continent, we're not quite there yet, because different yardsticks are used to assess success. Did the congressman or woman pay my family's tuition fees? Did they help with healthcare expenses, funeral and wedding? These are the sort of things we use to measure their success. Did they, as we say in Nigeria, provide stomach infrastructure, which is another name for food? Did they build roads in our communities, clinics, schools, etc.? So these are some of the things that make it much more difficult. Why is this happening? Answer is weak administrative capability of the state, ineffective institutions for service delivery, and yes, bribery and corruption. And as Congresswoman mentioned earlier, Chairman Bass mentioned earlier, third termism is becoming worrisome. This is the process whereby some form of constitutional coup, if you like, 15 of the 16 attempts between the period 2015-2021 succeeded. So enter the pandemics. COVID-19 set the world back, and it particularly set Africa back. Here's how it impacted. 14 countries postponed elections, as we also heard from Ranking Member Smith. Some manipulated the election schedules, Uganda. Some dismissed the virus as fake news, we heard, Tanzania. Some reduced campaigning and voter turnout. Many observers stayed away, as was just said. And of course, opposition voters, already wary of results, boycotted the elections. So what are the implications for the US-Africa relations? First of all, as we all know, expectations are high in Africa that the Biden-Harris administration will usher in a new dispensation, and that seems to be borne out as things are. And Africans continue to see the US as the most powerful country on earth.
Dr. Ordu,
Yes.
you have an opportunity to continue during Q&A. You can continue to make your points, but I'd like to move on to our next witness, Mr. Darnal.
Thank you very much.
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Before I begin, I would like to state for the record that the views expressed in this testimony are my own and do not represent the official position of the Attorney Council. The United States has been engaged on the continent to support African countries' economic and human development and to tackle security challenges amidst both democratic progress and backsliding. Particular focus has been paid to unstable regions as part of the American security and counterterrorism strategy. Yet, greater and sustained attention should also be given to more stable parts of the continent beyond the sole security lens. That is why I will focus my testimony on my experience working in Guinea from 2018 to 2019 during the onset of the 2020 electoral crisis. Guinea held parliamentary elections after a 2-year delay, a presidential election, and a constitutional referendum in 2020. The presidential party won the majority of the parliament seats. A new constitution that allowed President Congo to run again was passed, and subsequently, he was re-elected for a 3rd term. All 3 elections were marred by irregularities, disinformation, voter suppression, abuse of violence, and coercion by security forces. Violence also erupted between communities which are particularly polarized along political lines. My time in Guinea enabled me to witness what works, what could be done better, and what doesn't work in terms of foreign engagement seeking to support elections. Empowering local actors works. They are the better place to demand democracy. As we've seen in the past, removing or empowering a particular political leader or party often not only fails, but also alienates local populations who consider this type of interference to be illegal, illegitimate, and imperialistic. On the contrary, programs funded by the United States should be developed and implemented with and by local actors. Empowering them means equipping them with the tools to efficiently voice populations' needs and concerns and to hold political leaders accountable. It is also critical to diversify assistance to include all sectors ultimately supporting democracy. In that sense, the reduction in aid under the Trump administration was counterproductive. On the other hand, some policies implemented by the United States may impede democracy and credible elections. First, security assistance. Support to security forces can either be an enabler for peace or a catalyzer of destabilization. Given continued gross misconduct by Guinean security forces, there is a need to reinforce existing monitoring procedures and regularly assess the repercussions, even unintended, of American support to security forces on human rights in order to adapt policy as need be. Second, inconsistent rhetoric on democracy and credible elections, both at home and abroad, impedes the United States' credibility and legitimacy as a reliable partner to advancing democracy. Free passes to selective backsliding across the world, such as in Guinea, in Cameroon, or in Haiti, do not play in favor of American engagement abroad. The United States should not needlessly sacrifice its values in favor of its interests. Addressing this issue implies that the United States should strive to respect its commitment to democracy abroad and also at home. Third, the United States and the wider international community should move away from the belief that elections are a magic tool for democratization. Elections are generally showcased as a proof of the success of foreign intervention, in particular in post-conflict contexts. Yet, we have empirical examples that repeated elections in unfavorable contexts may create further chaos. Guinea, Cameroon, Central African Republic are only a few examples of this. Elections alone do not work. They need to be accompanied by efforts to build other democratic foundations in order to have sustainable and positive results. In that sense, continuing support by the United States and the international community to throw elections and authoritarian leaders raises concerns about outside parties' real interests. Fourth and finally, the United States should support regional cooperation. This means advancing the development and impact of regional organizations such as ECOWAS and the African Union, whose role in promoting elections is critical. It is also true for intra-Africa cooperation and diplomacy. Promoting African solutions for the continent will increase the likelihood that they will be accepted at the national and local levels. These are only a few of the many challenges impeding elections and democracy on the continent, but I hope this testimony will bring them to the forefront of the debate. Thank you again, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify before you today. It was a great honor and pleasure. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Omondi.
Chairman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to speak on the important topic of elections in Africa. And I also really want to thank you for the work you're doing in promoting democracy, health, and dignity in Africa. Madam Chair, I really want to thank you for the work you're doing in international election observation. I had the privilege to work with and see you in action when you led NDI's delegation to the 2017 Kenya elections. Ranking Member Smith, I want to thank you for your support for democracy and your support for the work of NDI and IRI. Madam Chair, last year was exceptionally difficult for elections in Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic increased the challenges facing elections in Africa. Incumbents used public health safeguards to tighten their grip in power by limiting political competition. Democratically inclined governments, on the other hand, Madam Chair, struggled to balance public health safeguards against the right to vote. Election observers were confronted with new realities, including restrictions on the ability to directly observe electoral activities. Thanks to the support we've received from the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and State Department, NDI was quickly able to pivot its electoral integrity assistance in Africa to respond to these constraints, particularly, Madam Chair, by adopting virtual techniques to support citizen election observer groups and to conduct international election assessment activities. These techniques were relevant and effective in multiple contexts, including in Ghana 2020, where, Madam Chair, you had the privilege of speaking in one of the roundtables we organized. Madam Chair, I was also asked to speak on the recent Uganda and upcoming elections in Ethiopia and Somalia. The election in Ethiopia, Madam Chair, will take place in a very challenging context, given COVID-19 and the prevailing concerns around security and politics in Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Friends of Ethiopia, Madam Chair, will need to work intensively to address the humanitarian needs, the security challenges, and the concerns about human rights violations across the country, and particularly in Tigray. Madam Chair, I believe that the election in Ethiopia is important, but it is but one in the many actions that will be needed to steady the political transition in the country. Madam Chair, the recent elections in Uganda was characterized by significant limitations on political and civic space. The level of violence against the main opposition candidate and his supporters was unprecedented. Freedom of information was curtailed. The level to, Madam Chair, was simply not fair and conducive to a credible election process. Unfortunately, that represents a disturbing trend we've seen in recent elections. Madam Chair, the lack of political agreement to find a way forward for the Somalia election presents a significant challenge for peace and security in the country and, as you've said, in the broader Horn of Africa. While it is incumbent upon Somalis to find consensus and forge a way forward, it is also incumbent upon the international community to continue working with them to find agreement and to guarantee any agreement that might come as a result. Madam Chair, the election in Somalia will be very important to keep Somalia on its path of post-conflict reconstruction. Despite these many challenges, Madam Chair, as you noted, there are many positive examples, including from recent elections in Ghana, Malawi, and Niger. Africa's better educated and more politically engaged youth, a growing judiciary and independence in the judiciary, the resilience we see in civil society, and as you mentioned, the abiding faith that Africans continue to have in democracy, all point to the possibilities of progress in Africa. Madam Chair, as I conclude, I would therefore like to recommend continued international partnerships to strengthen Africa's democratic institutions, to invest in Africa's civil society, especially women and youth, to continue support as you've done for international election observation activities, to support ongoing democratic transitions, and finally, to counter authoritarian rule and illiberal influences by China, Russia, and other regimes that aggressively seek to undermine democratic foundations in Africa. I thank you, Ranking Member Smith, and all members of the Distinguished Subcommittee for the important work you are doing. As always, we stand ready to provide you with insights and on-the-ground reports to assist in your work. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And our final witness, Mr. Dizolele. You're muted. You're muted right now.
There we go. Thank you very much. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, thank you for holding this timely and important hearing. And thank you for the opportunity to testify. It is a pleasure and an honor to be back before this committee and talk about development in Africa. By way of background, the International Republican Institute, IRI, is a non-profit, non-partisan organization working in more than 60 countries around the world. We are part of the National Endowment for Democracy family, along with our sister organizations, the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center. Our Africa team works in over 20 countries, including the Gambia, Nigeria, Mali, the DRC, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, the Central African Republic, and Chad, to name but a few. Our programs promote transparency and combat corruption, increase inclusion and political empowerment of women and youth and marginalized groups, and promote democratic values and support electoral integrity. We partner with a vast spectrum of actors, ranging from political parties, government, state houses of assembly, women organizations to youth groups, all indispensable pillars for change. Democracy and good governance initiatives are as challenging as they are rewarding. At IRI, we rejoice with our partners when they meet their objectives. We redouble our effort when they suffer setbacks and stand by their side as they push forward. We reckon that democracy is a marathon, not a sprint, with ups and downs. Madam Chairwoman, COVID-19 has allowed electoral processes to be manipulated to the benefit of authoritarian regimes. We have watched with great interest as African countries have held elections during these challenging times. Some elections have gone relatively well, others not quite. For instance, Ethiopia postponed elections citing COVID-19 and the state of emergency as a reason. However, they really were not ready to hold them, and the conflict with Tigray People's Liberation Front took precedent. In other instances, countries, as was the case in Tanzania and Burundi, went forward with elections even with the health risk, and were able to pull off elections with limited citizen or opposition party engagement and further tighten the ruling party's hold on power. Elections in Guinea, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda were marred with abuses, including voter intimidation, civic rights violation, harassment of the political opposition, and civil society. But we have also noted the non-respect of term limits and constitutional coups in Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, and even a military coup in Mali. Ethiopia and Somalia are still grappling with the challenges of election preparations as we speak. Madam Chairwoman, over the last several years, we have noted that despite states and government resistant to the wave of democratization, old one-party systems are now challenged like never before by determined opposition parties and strong civil society organizations. Autocratic tendencies, however, are on the rise as ruling parties capture state institutions, including courts and electoral commissions, to pervert the law in their favor. Today, the tension between the democratic aspiration of the citizens in Africa and the resurgence of autocratic preferences of the ruling party is most apparent. Madam Chairwoman, democracy is more than an election. While an election is the ultimate judgment day for citizens to voice their approval or rejection of their leaders, what happens in the interim is even more important for the advancement of democracy and good governance. Please allow me to say a few words about two countries whose upcoming election will certainly affect peace and stability in the Horn of Africa: the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Federal Republic of Somalia. IRI believes that fair, free, and competitive elections are critical to Ethiopia's future. While civil society is quite engaged and active in the lead up to elections, there is a belief that the election may be less competitive than hoped. IRI encourages and supports a strong media sector that will contribute to the accuracy of information around elections, and a broad-based and competitive civil society that helps to educate and adjudicate, and political parties that present their platforms in such a manner that citizens have a genuine choice. With regard to Somalia, IRI encourages the peaceful resolution of disagreement between the opposition and President Farmajo.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you'll have an opportunity to continue during Q&A. And I know, we keep hearing vote predictions, but we are finished with the witnesses and can jump into Q&A by both sides. Of course, we'll go back and forth. Democrat, Republican, we'll stick to 5 minutes. And then I am happy to do another round if people would like to continue on. And let me just say to my colleagues, especially since this is our first hearing, a wonderful opportunity when life gets back to normal and we can travel again is to do election observation. I know, Chris Smith, you've done it numerous times, but it's a wonderful bipartisan opportunity with our two institutes, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. I've done election observation in Zimbabwe as well as in Kenya, so I would encourage you to do that. The other thing is that I think often in the United States, we view Africa and its democracies like we're equal in terms of a democracy that's existed for over 200 years and one that's around 60 years. So I always say, if you're going to look at Africa, think of 1836 in terms of our own country, 60 years after independence. And we also always have to keep into consideration the role of former colonial powers. So I wanted to ask Ms. Darnal, because I think you were saying, and I'm not sure you were, if you were, please clarify, if you weren't, please clarify, that sometimes the other thing that we do here is we insist on elections every 4 years or 6 years, whatever it is, in African countries, regardless of the stability. If they're in the middle of a conflict, we still say that the election should happen. And I want to know if you were saying that we should not be so rigid, and if you could expand on that a little more. And then also, what about other things that African countries do, such as change their constitutions and have votes on changing the constitution that then eliminates term limits? How should the West look at that? And what can we do to be helpful to bolster democracies in Africa. I often use the example of the Gambia when President Jammeh refused to step down, and the African countries in the region, led by a woman, I must say, the president of Liberia, Johnson Sirleaf, went over and they gave him a notice. They said, either you step down within 24, 48 hours or we're coming for you. And they went for him and he left. And so how do we support African countries strengthen their democracies on their own? So could you respond to that, Ms. Darnal?
Sure, thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for this question. So I'm going to start with the first one relating to my point on elections being somewhat advertised as, sometimes a magic. What I said is a magic tool for democratization. So I think it's a complex question, and I think whether in the literature or with empirical cases, we've seen that there is a debate on whether we should push for elections and have repeated elections because they have positive impact on backsliding by putting forward democracy, or whether we should in fact push forward for strengthening the foundations for stability before having elections. I don't have a perfect answer to that question, but I think my point was to say, in any case, election or the voting process in itself is not the only component to ensure democracy. To have elections and to have successful elections, to have sustainable positive impact on democracy, we need to implement a variety of tools to ensure that elections promote democracy. So this means that, for instance, that we also need to promote local actors like the civil society. We've talked about the marginalization of civilians, such as the youth or women. We need to engage local actors to empower the marginalized actors so that they can have a voice the needs of the population, but also hold leaders accountable. So my point was really that elections alone are not enough. And I think my fellow witnesses also stress this fact. On the second question, what can we do to support African states in pursuing efforts towards democracy? I think, and that's one of my points in my testimony, and that's also what I've seen in the field. I think there is a need to, again, empower the civil society, work with local institutions. I'm thinking, for instance, in Guinea, the Electoral Independent Commission, that was accused of not being impartial or neutral in the 2020 elections. I'm thinking about strengthening local NGOs and existing mechanisms that exist to prevent, for instance, electoral violence. I'm thinking about community level mechanisms with religious leaders, youth leaders, women leaders that already exist and that often work outside any formal coordination. Also often lack training to ensure that they can effectively prevent electoral violence. We also have the possibility to support regional cooperation, and that's why I was talking about African solutions. Often what we see in the ground often is that engagement from foreign forces, whether it is the United States or European countries, can be seen as interference by local populations, even though the projects or funding through or international organizations or the United States come with let's say positive goals of advancing democracy. We see that they can be, because of lack of transparency, because of disinformation as well, misinformation, local populations can take those disengagement as interference. And I think that advancing regional cooperation, advancing intra-Africa diplomacy could be a positive solution to ensure that there is first a sound understanding of the needs of African states, but also ownership and acceptation of the interventions that will be put forward by regional organizations and supported by international actors to advance democracy.
Thank you very much. Let me go to the ranking member for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you. A couple of points, and thank to all of our witnesses for their very incisive testimony. It really does help this subcommittee. You know, a couple of years ago, the chairwoman, I was actually chair then, he flips back and forth as Congress flips back and forth. We went to Ethiopia right as Abe, the new prime minister, was doing tremendous things. I'm just wondering if our distinguished panelists might want to speak to the arrests of Jamar Mohammed and Iskender Nega, whether or not that has exacerbated the tensions. Do you think that the charges brought against Iskender, for example, who is ethnic Amhara, was done to balance the arrest of ethnic Oromos like Jawar? You know, just what could be done to get out of this deteriorating situation? Secondly, if I could, the issue of Somaliland, which I mentioned in my opening comments, and I mentioned also that the EU, Sweden, the UK provided financial support to the National Electoral Commission. And I'm wondering why isn't the US more active in promoting free and fair elections there in Somaliland region? And added to that, how about IRI and NDI? Are you planning on going there? Have you asked for funds to be there to help make sure that that is a good election? And on DR Congo, as I mentioned also in my opening comments, many independent observers believe that Martin Fayulu won the last presidential election in the DRC in 2018, but Tshisekedi got the nod and is now, of course, the head of the government and was declared the winner. But there were statements made by U.S. Department of State officials that many of us found very disturbing. And I wonder if any of our witnesses might want to comment on the statement itself and what impact that might have on other countries looking at, you know, do we just consolidate and say, even if the evidence suggests otherwise, that it was the right outcome in terms of who actually won that election? So I'd yield to our witnesses. Maybe Dizolele, you might want to start off with the DR Congo.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. The DR Congo is obviously a very complicated case. We had the elections that you have referenced. 2 years after those elections, things have changed quite a bit. That is the fact that you have presented what was accepted at the time, the challenge about the result of the election. The president of the Electoral Commission was eventually sanctioned over this. The US did sanction him. But I think we also need to come back to today. Today, there's a serious shift that's happening in Congo. President Kabila's coalition in parliament, in both chambers of the parliament, have lost their footing. President Tshisekedi had threatened to dissolve the parliament so that because he felt that the parliament was standing on his way. And this was not about the opposition. This was about the tough relationship he had with the Kabila coalition, which were supposed to be his partners. So since then, both leaders of the chambers, both chambers have been ousted. The president of the Senate resigned. The president of the lower house resigned as well. And the President Tshisekedi is on track to appoint a government that is reflective of his political agenda. What does this mean moving forward? And what can the United States do? There are a lot of issues about the last election. But as we know, elections are important, but what is equally important is what's happening in the interim. So for us at IRI, we've been working with political parties, we've been working with youth groups, we've been working with members of parliament to bring about reforms, because there are a number of legislation on the table now within parliament that have stalled. And those reforms involve the electoral law, to reform the way that the Electoral Commission functions, to make it truly independent so that whatever happened last time does not happen again, to reform the tax system and revenue system, to inform the military. Until all those pieces are in place, we risk running the same problem come 2023, which is around the corner. Certainly, President Tshisekedi would like to win. There are issues dating from the election in 2019, but he's the president now and he's working hard to win. I think what the United States can do, things being as they are, is to put a lot of pressure on President Tshisekedi and his people to deliver on these reforms so we don't have a repeat of what happened last time. I thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to speak, or the others as well, about Somaliland and whether or not you'll be deployed there, or NDI as well?
We're out of time, Representative Smith, but we will come back to that. Let me see, Mr. Phillips, Representative Phillips.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass and Ranking Member Smith, for hosting a terribly important subcommittee hearing. And to our witnesses, gratitude to all of you. We're all well aware, too aware, that America witnessed the fragility of its own democracy recently, and even the challenges in the United States of holding free and fair elections in which people have faith. And we all must recommit to improving democracy both here and abroad. And I want to start my questioning relative to Ethiopia. I have a significant diaspora in the community I represent in Minnesota, and I am terribly, terribly concerned about what I'm seeing in Tigray, as we're all aware. Horrified is a better word. The reports of atrocities against civilians being committed by both the Amhara and Eritrean forces are jarring. And I'm terribly concerned about the well-being of the Oromo prisoners who are on the hunger strike, protesting their detention, harassment of their family, their supporters, and their exclusion from participating in the upcoming June elections. So the closing of political space is terribly worrisome, to say the least. So Mr. Omondi, we're all aware of Secretary of State Blinken's recent calls to withdraw troops from Tigray. But what more can the U.S. do? What more should the U.S. do to address these dangerous and acute issues in the Tigray region?
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, the situation in Ethiopia is very complex, but I think one of the underlying issues that we will need to consider is the level of engagement necessary to continue with the Ethiopian authorities to address these particular issues. In the last few days, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, for instance, has announced steps to allow humanitarian workers, international NGOs, and media, independent media to Tigray. And I think that's one area where the US can continue working with the Ethiopian authorities to ensure in particular that there is a full, independent, and accurate picture of the humanitarian needs and conditions and human rights conditions in Tigray. Because representative, there has been a lot of information about those atrocities, and ensuring that we get a full and accurate picture, I think, will be the first step to being able to determine how to address those particular ones. I think in the context of the elections, it is equally important. Well, before I get to the elections, in terms of the politicians who've been arrested, as Ranking Member Smith asked, it is certain that there's been a lot of regression in tensions since the murder of the musician Hachalu Hundessa some time back. And a lot of the fallout can be traced to that particular instance and the social unrest that followed. The Prime Minister has also in the recent past met with opposition leaders. And I do think encouraging him to keep meeting with opposition leaders to agree on the broad framework and consensus and conditions that will allow them to participate in the election will be important, because as mentioned, the current hunger strike and so on and so forth are really creating tensions in Ethiopia.
And sir, if I might ask, what are, from your perspective, what is the likelihood, what are the prospects for free and fair elections this June in Ethiopia?
I think there is and I said it, that there is a number of issues that will need to be addressed, that the election in itself will not be able to resolve and put Ethiopia back on its path of democratic transition. I do see the imperative for peace and security for the election to proceed, but this broader context is deeply worrying, and without addressing it, I do think that there will be significant questions that we will all ask ourselves about the quality of that election. It does go back to an earlier point that was also raised about whether elections should proceed in such circumstances. I think Congressman Bass asked that particular question. It is important, in my view, that where decisions are made to postpone elections in such context, that comes as a result of broad-based, inclusive, open dialogue with all the major political actors, because I do think there were significant opportunities missed, not just in the context of Ethiopia, but also in Somalia, to be able to get that consensus, to be able to move forward with the election process.
Well, thank you, Mr. Omondi. I see my time's about to expire, so Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Representative Issa? Representative Issa. He looks a little busy. How about Representative Stube? Would you like to go?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, hold on. Let us reset the clock.
Okay. Just let me know when you want me to go.
There you go. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for Mr. Dizolele. How has the influence of foreign actors impacted elections in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years? And specifically, how do you see Russian and Chinese involvement in sub-Saharan Africa impacted democratic movements across the continent?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman Stube. I'm going to start on a couple with China. China has been very influential in Africa. They have a big purse. They bring a lot of money with them, but also structure to go with it. So the role they've played is, when it comes to elections especially, is that they provide another alternative. When Western countries and other countries in Africa put pressure on government X doesn't have to be pliable because they can go the other route and get the Chinese to help with them. The Chinese also have been good at providing technology that helps with surveillance, which strengthen the hold of the ruling parties or the government in power. But the Chinese are not alone, like you just said. The Russians are inching their way further and further into Africa. One country where they're really influential is the Central African Republic. They provide a lot of support to the current president with his security, with training the FACA, which is the military of Central African Republic, but also guaranteeing more influence. In fact, Russia is running a radio now in Bangui in the local language. This means they have a tremendous influence. They will eventually get a lot of influence in the natural resources and others. But in the Horn of Africa, you also have to count Turkey and the Arab states, which the Gulf state particularly will have tremendous influence as well. We saw UAE and other Arab states, Gulf states, have a lot of influence in Sudan during the crisis, keeping the Sudanese government and the regime there afloat.
Have you seen an increase, or has this influence changed or increased in recent years from both the Russian and the Chinese?
It's continued to grow, sir. It's continued to grow. And I think this is the part where the United States could play a major role, because I think if China and other actors are getting a stronger foothold and a greater footprint, it's because the US has not stepped up in the way that we can. We're very present. We work a lot, my colleagues at NDI, IRI, and elsewhere, but we are limited in what we can do. And I think we need to increase our capacity of in affecting the groups, the youth groups, the women. Africa is a young continent. There's great opportunity with the rising generation to mold them to fit their own democratic aspiration, so then they can serve as the bulwark in protecting their resources and their readily available partners for the United States. I think there is a great opportunity here, but that opportunity will be missed if we step back and let the Russians and others continue to gain a greater foothold. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, under the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China has steadily strengthened its influence in sub-Saharan Africa through diplomatic engagement, increased trade and foreign direct investment, and infrastructure development through the Belt and Road Initiative. CCP-controlled technology companies like Huawei and ZTE have built more than 40 telecom networks in over 30 African countries, including many government networks. Yahweh's influence includes striking deals with African states to install surveillance systems that can be used to spy on political opponents. What can you say about the impact that Chinese surveillance technology has already had or could have on elections in sub-Saharan Africa?
Sir, it has tremendous impact now. We know, of course, that now a lot of civil society organization and political parties that we've partnered with have moved to the digital platforms, the WebEx of the world, the Zoom of the world. But the government, through the technology they have the capacity to shut off the internet whenever they want. This is one area where to do this. In a lot of countries now, everybody, including the market lady, has moved to get a VPN to protect their communication, because the Chinese and others are helping this government to meddle in the communication. So that's one area. But in other places, pretty much all the phones that the population use are made by the Chinese, Huawei being one of them. And with the backdoors and other technological advances, this gives the partners, namely the government, a strong control grip on what's happening in terms of communication. So the internet is pretty much controlled by a lot of these companies that come from. Huawei that you mentioned is omnipresent on the continent. So that's one area they do. In certain countries, like in Zambia, the Chinese even took hold of the newspapers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Mr. Malinowski, the Vice Chair of the committee and former Ambassador for Democracy. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks to our witnesses. I want to come back to the conversation about Ethiopia, because I think it is useful to be as focused as we can be on a crisis that is developing in the moment. And I wanted to ask any of the witnesses who might wish to come back to the question of the detained opposition leaders. Just a word on my background. Chairwoman Bass mentioned that I have been at the State Department before. I made, I think, 4 or 5 trips to Ethiopia when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights under the previous government, urging a political opening and dialogue as the solution to this country's deep problems. We then, of course, saw the rise of a new prime minister who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in that direction, and yet the country is still in turmoil. So I'm wondering, first of all, what specifically would you all recommend the government of Ethiopia do, and what should the United States be urging it to do with regard to these leaders? Should they, would you say simply that they should be amnestied and released and allowed to participate in the elections? That's for whoever wants to jump in.
Congressman, I will chip in here. I think the arrests of these leaders is a symptom of the larger problem that we see in Ethiopia, namely a lot of tension that has festered over the years. At this specific juncture, as Ethiopia is looking into elections, I think there's a role, the US can play a major role here in helping to diffuse, and namely this will mean an amnesty to those leaders, but also this should be part of a larger national dialogue in terms of reconciliation. Because I think the conflict, of course, as we see, is not just in Tigray, it's in various places. Oromia is one that has had issues in a long time, and other places. As we enter this space, national dialogue and reconciliation will be very important, but also we're very focused on elections in the here now. What is going to be even more important is what's happening in the post-election. So as we look at the election, we also start be looking at the reform of the judiciary, which is important and it's not happened. In the case of the arrest, it's quite common that the court may decide to release somebody and then the security sector put them back in jail. So there's a lot of disconnect there, and I think we can play a role, the United States, that is the government and Congress, because until that happens, election by themselves are not going to solve those problems. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that makes tremendous sense. But again, I think sometimes one does have to make pretty clear choices in policy, and so it's sort of a binary choice whether these opposition members should be released as part of that the dialogue. I would hope that the answer from the U.S. government is yes. Would you say, we have a new administration? Obviously, President Biden has been in office for a short period of time. We do not have an Assistant Secretary of State confirmed for Africa yet. So, given that, would you say there's more that the Biden administration can be doing, whether with regard to the situation in Tigray or the situation with the detained leaders, one of whom is an American citizen, after all? Would you say that our embassy, our diplomats have been assertive enough in addressing this urgent situation?
Congressman, as you know, diplomats work behind closed doors, and it's always hard to assess what they're doing. So I will defer maybe to my colleagues if they have more insight into that. But I do believe that the US government has a greater role to play than what is done so far. In our space as implementers, we have a lot of support, and we thank you for that. But I think when it comes to these human rights issues, there's more to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Musar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Dizolele, the CCP, as has been discussed, strengthens its influence throughout Africa. And I'm interested in your comments on the control technology companies, primarily Highway, ZTE, regarding some of their involvements, particularly related to the surveillance technology being utilized related to elections in some of the sub-Saharan countries. You had mentioned something about that a little while ago. Would you mind expanding upon that, Mr. Dizolele?
Thank you, Congressman Musar. There is no way to understate the Chinese influence in the IT, especially in telecommunication space in Africa. They have something I'll call quasi-monopoly. They provide the technology that these ruling parties and government need. They provide the money to go with the infrastructure that this government needs. They provide them the loan when they cannot afford it. And then they provide them the know-how to do this. So this will manifest itself in various forms. The technological side, but also the know-how, and sometimes even with the press. The Chinese are known to invite leaders of the press, journalists, and so on to Beijing to help them in the way that they should cover what's happening in their country. The country that I just mentioned recently, not that long ago, is Zambia, where at one point the Chinese literally took over a newspaper. And so it's a combination of these two areas, hardcore technology of telecommunication, and then the software of it that goes with communication in terms of newspaper, broadcasting, and others. So that's at the intersection where they are. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Ethiopia specifically, related to the elections that just took place in the Tigray region. The fact that largely within defiance of the demanded delay from the Ethiopian government, Tigray's People Liberation Front, in Tigray, they carried out the elections. And so clearly causing many problems, as well as the displacement of perhaps as many as 2 million people. So my question to you is somewhat of a large one. What do you feel the U.S., United States Congress, what role can we play supporting such election integrity, helping strengthen democratic institutions in Ethiopia, and providing support to help bring peace and order to the area, to the people in the elections?
Congressman, I think the case of Tigray is definitely a thorny one. They did have, they did do what they did, but the challenge is, one, we do not have a sense, it's hard to say exactly because we don't have a sense of TPLF support even in Tigray. It's not very clear how much support they have. And then we also need to find a way so that the other people of Tigray is a big place, so not everybody's in one block. We should guarantee that they have access to the election that will be taking place. On the other hand, I think we should be realistic and accept that timeline has been slipping for a long time in Ethiopia now. Everything is behind. The election, however they happen, will be messy. They will not be perfect. So we need to come to that realization. And then within that realization, chart a course of how we're going to work with the Ethiopian people. At IRI, we've been guests of the Ethiopian government, of the Electoral Commission, to help them, help civil society carry out civic education and voter education. This is very important. Everything has been focused on Addis, like is often the case in a lot of countries. Everything is about Addis, when in fact, Ethiopia is a big country. We need to carry programs elsewhere around the country so that Ethiopia can move forward in something that's more adequate. Thank you, sir.
And I'm sorry, it seems like I'm always interrupting you, but you'll continue to have more time. I'm going to turn the gavel now over to the subcommittee vice chair, Representative Omar, who will continue to ask, while I go vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. And thank you all for coming to testify in front of the committee. My first question is to Ms. Darnal.
But I don't want to do that because this is...
Karen, you're not muted yet, Chairwoman. Okay. Paul Pia has ruled Cameroon for 39 years. Tredo Beg has ruled Ecuadorian Guinea for 42 years. Yoweri Museveni has ruled Uganda for 35 years. Every one of them has held elections throughout their time in office. It seems clear that there are many cases, certainly not only in Africa, where elections end up just being a box-checking exercise for autocrats. And I think that there is a significant extent to which it works. Uganda, Cameroon are security partners for the US. So is Mali. We sell them weapons, we train their security forces, we do joint exercises with their militaries. We suspend those things when these atrocities get too bad to ignore, as in Cameroon, or when there is an outright military coup, as in Mali. But then with elections, even when they don't really represent the will of the people, we go right back to it. And of course, elections are important if they are representing the legitimate voice or choice of the people. But when they are not, when they're not just offering international legitimacy to dictators or military regimes, I think we have to seriously reconsider how we approach them. So my question to you, Ms. Darnal, is let's take Mali as an example. Since they are still ruled by the leader of the coup, what are the other markers of democracy besides elections that we should be looking for to decide there has been a genuine transition to democracy there?
Thank you, Representative Omar, for this question. I think you have talked about a number of issues, and I think I touched upon those earlier. when addressing Representative Bass' question. I think in terms of, keeping on holding 2 elections raises several questions. First, the interest of the international community. As you said, quite often we continue to see approval from the international community for 4 elections, which kind of raises concerns for their interest and also the alignment between values, for instance, values of the United States for democracy and others, and alignment with interests, whether they are economic, strategic, security interests. And I think that, when I was saying earlier that we shouldn't needlessly sacrifice values for interest, is that we need to really consider what we understand as critical interests and what are the values that we can or cannot sacrifice for them. I think when we take Cameroon or Mali, whether it is about France's support or the American support for President Biya, I think that these are examples where interest for stability, for security stability, have had took the lead on values for democracy and having real elections. Other markers are, when we talk about markers for democracy, I think other markers are obviously the participation of marginalized voices. I talked about earlier about the youth, about the women. We know that the youth, which represent the majority of the population across the country, and women remain marginalized. They have limited. They generally participate in a limited capacity in political processes and in elections. Yet there are important voices that need to be empowered so that they can put at the forefront of the debate the various challenges that they encounter on a daily basis. We also see that participation of those actors in local processes to avoid electoral violence as well has bear fruit. I'm thinking, for example, in Guinea, I've myself developed projects, and I've seen also projects developed by local NGOs that seek to strengthen capacities of local actors in preventing electoral violence, in raising awareness among populations about electoral processes and democracies, also in holding political leaders accountable. I think freedom of expression also is an important marker. In 2009, in Guinea, there was a major massacre a year after the military coup, during which the opposition held a peaceful rally in a stadium, and during which the military led a violent crackdown, which I think ended up with more than 150 civilian casualties, widespread reports of sexual violence and rape and collective rape. And I think, oh yeah, sorry,
Thank you. We have run out of time. I really appreciate your thoughtful response to that. I will now recognize Ranking Member Smith.
Sorry, Kim.
I think she said Smith.
I just texted you the word.
Okay, I will now recognize Kim.
Great. Thank you, Chairwoman. And I would like to also thank our ranking member, Chris Smith. Mr. Dizolele, I'd like to direct my first question to you. We know from years of investment and development from the Belt and Road Initiative and financial assistance that the People's Republic of China has staked out a considerable interest in sub-Saharan Africa in order to expand its sphere of influence abroad. So to your best judgment, has CCP influence or finances been directed towards elections in any African country during the past few years? Furthermore, can you testify to the relationship between the African Union and the PRC, and if leverage has been exerted to realize any political outcomes in the region?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kim. The CCP and the Chinese governments and all economic structures come to bear quite a bit across sub-Saharan Africa. That remains a fact. But how much influence do they have in terms of election is hard to say, because they're never front and center when it comes to the process itself. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the other ways, I think, where they come to weigh in, and that is surveillance, for instance, the skill. They, of course, arm these regimes. I mean, I was traveling recently in Africa somewhere where I saw a lot of Chinese military trucks. It was actually the first time I was seeing those. So they're very present that way. Unfortunately, when we talk about election in Africa, all these components come to play a role. The military is present, the police is present, technology is present, and all those segments are influenced by Chinese. As for the African Union, of course, the African Union is made of the same leaders of these countries that we're referring to. And China is very friendly with the African Union, including China that built the headquarters of the African Union. So they're very cozy in that way. They bring a lot of money, and the leaders of countries in Africa need that money. So the relationship is very cozy. And I'll dare to say, yes, it has influence in elections, but not in the direct way that we will judge them in other countries. Thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you next about our efforts to support political transparency and good governance in Africa. In your view, are we using all our diplomatic and economic tools effectively?
I will say that the US government and our embassies, some of whom we have had to interact with at IRI, they've been very helpful in helping us do the work that we do. But the work we are called to do is really big. You know, Africa is bound to have more than 1 billion people pretty soon, and most of them are going to be young people below the age of 20. Those are the partners that we need to work with. So we need more engagement on the US part, outside the box, bypassing the old generation and investing in the youth, investing in women who make up half of the population of African countries. So there is room for us to improve. And I'll call on the US government to engage even more. And I'll call on you and your colleagues to unlock that purse so we can carry more in terms of civic education, voter education, capacity building for civil society. And this is what we did pretty much across the board. And this is important in the interim between the election, because that's when the work needs to be done. Thank you, ma'am.
Are there some organizations or tactics that have been more effective than others? Can you give us an example?
I think for us, again, as implementers, my colleagues can also attest to this, capacity building works just wonder. Because once you give people the capacity, it's then up to their creativity. It's their country, they know the culture, they know how to adjust it, and they run with it, so to speak. And we've seen this. We've seen this in Nigeria with the youth taking kind of responsibility with movement like Not Too Young to Run, trying to increase their representation in public office. We've seen this in other places. We've seen this in DRC, where members of parliament who are reform-minded are asking more support. So this actually works. It's a long haul. Like I said earlier, we're in the marathon.
Gentlewoman,
we're not in the sprint.
Oh, is my time up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I was back.
I now recognize Member Bera.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And my apologies, I had to go off and vote if some of these questions were previously asked, but just continuing on the line of questioning of Congresswoman Kim and the influence of China, both directly in terms of party building. I think we've seen some of that take place in Ethiopia, and trying to build more authoritarian models in the model of the Chinese Communist Party. But then also, in the context of COVID-19 and, for lack of a better way of describing it, vaccine diplomacy, are we seeing the Chinese offer their versions of the vaccine as part of a broader influence campaign, both politically, but also, to help sway elections? And I think any of the witnesses that would want to, talk about, influence in the context of the COVID-19 and the vaccines.
Thank you, Representative Rivera. I think that, let me first go back to the question of the work the Chinese are doing with political parties, because I think reflecting the previous question that was answered, there's a direct correlation between political parties and elections. As a matter of fact, political parties are one of the primary participants in election processes. And we have seen the Chinese Communist Party being very deliberate about engaging, particularly with ruling parties in Africa. So about 2-3 years back, they brought together all these liberation political parties and were planning to establish a training center for political parties based in Tanzania. Quite recently, we've also seen the United Russia Party actually making agreements with political parties in Africa on exchanges and study visits. So similar to the concerns you have around infrastructure development, the absence of the US and others creates space for the Chinese to engage with political parties. And as you've rightly captured, it's all about promoting Chinese influence, and particularly the idea of one dominant, strong ruling party. And no wonder, I think, that you see authoritarians finding Chinese help very attractive. In the
maybe if I can ask a follow-up question to that. One of the programs that I think many of us were supportive about under the Obama administration was YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative. And if any of the witnesses could comment on how effective programs like YALI are identifying young African leaders, working with them, bringing them to the United States. Is that an effective type of program that we should not only continue supporting, but also expand?
Certainly from my perspective, yes. And in one of my recommendations, I've talked about continued investment in African youth and women. I think the YALI program and any investment that is made in young people is very important to ward off that attraction and space that the Chinese and the Russians are trying to appropriate. A couple of years back, NDI organized a visit for political party leaders from Africa to come to the US. And one of the questions you had them ask was just about basic things about how they're treated when they're in China versus sort of the allowances they're given when they're in the US. So there are issues there about teaching them things that necessarily we who work on democracy would not like to promote. So I think it's important to keep investing in young people. I think it's important for the US to engage in this, because absent that, we definitely will see more young people. And a colleague of mine went beyond just political party exchanges. It's about education. The number of young Africans coming to study in the US, for example, is now much less than it was decades back. And conversely, you see more of them going to China. So that is the sustained engagement that we are asking of our allies, so that you strengthen the solidarity networks with African Democrats, and you are able to counter these trends in authoritarianism and the liberal influences from China and others. On the COVID-19 question, I also wanted to agree with you that we saw quite a push on Chinese diplomacy around this. There was a lot of equipment, protective equipment that was being flown around the continent, donated by Jack Ma. And I think it's really important for the US and others to engage. But thankfully, the news we have now is that based on the COVAX-19 agreements and cooperation, about 24 African countries are starting to receive vaccines. So Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Kenya is getting about 1 million tonight. And I think that's very important because
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Member Jacobs is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have 2 questions, so I'll ask the panelists to answer as succinctly as possible. My first is, we know that elections tend to be a time of stress for countries. We often see violence around elections, but it seems like the United States and the international community more broadly are often responding to this violence or responding to the democratic backsliding after it happens. And I was wondering if Ms. Darnal or Dr. Ordu have any specific suggestions on how we can engage better, either through the State Department or the international community, to better be able to work on preventing that violence before it happens, and do some of those upstream programs that so many of you discussed before we actually have to respond to what's happening.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Jacobs. I think this is a very, very important question. And it goes to the heart of the issue that was discussed earlier about sustained engagement. I mean, they cannot be that the US is in and out, but the sustained engagement is the key. If you ask any African up and down from the southern Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope, there are some things Africans need. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. And is the US visibly present in Africa's infrastructure? Because all these have to do with elections as well, and the quality of life and well-being. So better to create jobs for Africa's youths on the continent, to reduce fragility, to improve livelihoods, and to expand markets for the US goods. The alternative right now is that African youths are ending up in the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. This treacherous journey, and some of them end up in Europe, and of course the majority also end up here in the United States. So it's very important, one, Congress with the administration, institutions like the International Development Finance Corporation of the US, Prosper Africa, Power Africa, MCC, they all exist. How do we use these excellent building blocks for commercial, investment, and trade relations? This is very, very important. Second, Africans are now than ever before acting in solidarity, as we saw in the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Africa CDC. US continued support to these entities is crucial. Third, the African Development Bank has a soft window that focuses on the poor countries on the African continent. So also does the World Bank. 2 of the institutions I've spent the last 30 years in. And these institutions, these low-income focused institutions, have used up their firepower, as you know, to help fight the pandemics. Now, they need to be replenished. I think it'd be great for Congress and the administration to really, really be very supportive in the replenishment of these soft windows. Thank you.
Thank you. And my next question is to Mr. Dizolele or Mr. Omondi. We know the situation in Somalia is incredibly urgent and, in my opinion, not getting the high-level attention that it deserves. A deal was struck to buy a couple of weeks of time so that President Farmajo is not the person setting the terms for the next election, but those weeks must be used to establish rules of the road that all parties can live with. And I was wondering if either of you have thoughts on how the US should respond to ensure that these rules of the roads are set, and specifically who the State Department should be engaging with in the region or in Somalia to make sure that that happens.
So let me offer some quick thoughts, and then I will yield to my colleagues. First, I think that the US needs to involve with all the major actors in Somalia, the federal government of Somalia, the federal member states, and opposition presidential candidates. And beyond that, I will even argue that civil society, women and youth should be included on all discussions that are going on in the US, in Somalia. Secondly, I think that unless and until there's a permanent and sustainable political and electoral structure in Somalia, US will need to keep engaging in this type of discussions that are going on right now. And in that, as I've said in my first point, engaging with all the parties involved. I think the US has an important role alongside the international community, acting as guarantors. I think there are huge sections of Somali people who are asking for international guarantors to these agreements, and that I think is important. And then lastly, I will say that with respect to Sudan, there was text that got into the National Defense Appropriation Act for fiscal year 2021 with respect to particular benchmarks for the transition and incentives and so on and so forth. That type of forward planning and legislation will be very important in the context of transitions going on within the region, including Somalia and Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Member Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for this very useful hearing and their testimony. I'm very delighted that our first subcommittee hearing is about elections in Africa, because I think it's an important way for us to reassert American leadership on democracy, human rights, and elections are a critical part of that. So this is a terrific way to start. My first question is for Mr. Omondi. Could you speak a little bit about the role that COVID is playing in African elections, and particularly criticisms of government, often based on a lot of misinformation about their response to the pandemic, and how that's implicating press coverage and the ability for candidates to speak freely, and particularly with relation to online communications. And I know a number of governments have done certain things to restrict its use. So could you just speak to the impact of that generally?
I think that as all my other witnesses have covered, COVID-19 has really been used by incumbents to strengthen their grip on power and to limit political competition. In Uganda, for example, we saw an idea which was novel, that there was going to be only what is called scientific campaigning, that candidates will only be able to do things online. And you know, you have to ask the question about how such measures favor or not incumbents who have disproportionate access to state resources and to networks, government networks, that they can use to do their own campaigns. And as you've rightly said, close to that, there has been disturbing trends of controlling the information space in many of the countries here. Internet shutdowns are becoming very common. And beyond that, the use of internet to try and sow disinformation. So again, going back to Uganda, there was measures taken by Facebook to limit one of the parties there because of using or not adhering to the requirements of use of that particular media. But in retaliation, what we saw then was a complete shutdown that affected all candidates in the election. And lastly, I will say that the monitoring of social media is very robust, and you know, if you go back to Huawei in Uganda again, questions about whether that was used to particularly surveil opposition politicians and civil rights and activists and leaders.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to ask Mr. Dizolele. You know, I think the United States takes a lot of pride in the way that we respond to democratic elections, and I'd like to know kind of generally whether you think the U.S. has responded consistently and clearly to a democratic backsliding in African countries, and to what degree you view our diplomatic efforts to counter illegitimate elections in Africa, such as the imposition of sanctions or public messaging, confidential meetings with foreign officials, and the delivery of diplomatic protests as being effective, and why or why not, and what other things can we be doing, including as members of Congress, to discourage this backsliding, which sadly we're seeing not only on the continent of Africa, but in places all over the world.
Thank you, Congressman Cicilline. The United States, as we've said a few times today, has an important role to play, and sometimes the US plays it well, sometimes not as well. When it comes to backsliding, the US is very vocal typically when the backsliding is happening within that electoral time frame. And then the US kind of relaxes its posture post-election. And then the cycle repeats itself. I think there is room here for the United States government and maybe Congress to engage more in the interim. We've talked a lot today about election not being perfect, whether it's in the US or elsewhere. That's the nature of the beast. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't work well. Where we cannot relax is our engagement with civil society, our engagement with the youth, the engagement with women, and our engagement with the ruling parties. Because the ruling parties are not our enemies. We work with them. They invite us. We're present in all these countries where we are present, whether it's NDI or IRI or our sister organizations. We're there because we're invited. So they want us there. And so it behooves the United States government to continue engaging, particularly in the interim. That's the only way we can break the cycle.
Thank you. I just have a couple of seconds left, so I'm going to ask a question I know you won't get to answer, but hopefully you can do it in writing. And that is, in the recent experiences we've had in our own country fighting to preserve our own democracy and challenges to our democratic elections by our former president and his allies, what effect is that having on our ability to be advocates for democracy and free and fair elections on the continent of Africa? And how has that impeded our work? And I'd invite you to submit written answers to that question. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. At this time, we will start a second round of questions for members who want to have the opportunity to learn more from the witnesses. And I will yield myself extra 5 minutes to start us off. Mr. Omondi, I wanted to follow up on the line of questioning in regards to Somalia that my colleague Jacobs was asking. You alluded to the fact that it might be important for us, the United States administration, to help guide the process in having elections take place in Somalia. We know that there are many competing interests in Somalia from different nations that have invested in the country and continue to be invested. How does the nation sort of work through all of those interests and make sure that there are legitimate voices to engage with in the international arena that will ultimately lead to peaceful transitions of power for Somalia and further stabilization of the nation?
Thank you. I see a very important role for the US and international partners, but I do want to go back a step that I believe that it is incumbent upon the Somalis to lead and forge consensus on the way forward. I think the international community can play a very important role, but it's a role in support of the efforts of the Somali people, however frustrating and protracted that process has been. Second, I think that the US can work more closely and in concert with other international partners, the UK, the Europeans, and so on and so forth. And as a matter of fact, a bit of that is already going on through the UNDP basket that supports the election there. But as you rightly mentioned, there are also other actors, particularly from the Gulf Arab states, Turkey and others, who are providing support in that particular context. So having a view of those and what they mean is the type of issues I think will be important to think through, do a bit of forward planning, and address in a clear policy by the administration. I thank you.
And then my second question is to maybe all of you. I know that the diaspora plays a huge role in what happens in different parts of different African nations. And so I'm wondering, what is your assessment of how they help or hinder elections in Africa?
I think I'll go first on this, Congresswoman Omar. I think the diaspora has a major role to play, and they've actually played it well in most cases. They are better informed often than the people inside just because of the nature of communication. They engage you, congressman, they engage US government in the ways that people in countries cannot do. And then they inform the countrymen and women, the fellow citizen, and they engage even with the government. And beyond all, they really support financially to move the process forward. I'll yield my time to my colleagues. Thank you.
If I can add on that, I would also add that diaspora also has a right to vote. And for example, I will go back to the case of Guinea because of the census that was engaged just a few weeks, I think 15 days before the presidential election in October 2020. Actually, the diaspora, in particular, I'm thinking about the in Senegal, was not able to vote. And we also know, for instance, that in the case of Senegal, mostly the diaspora generally votes for the opposition. So I think that the diaspora importance is also demonstrated when it comes to the right to vote or separation of their rights. I think that can also be an enabler for peace by spreading awareness among the population, but also of misinformation and disinformation in some cases. So I think that those also are important elements to take into account.
If I may, Chairman Omar, on the diaspora issue, I think it's also a two-way street, right? Because take, for example, the specific instance of harsh NSAS in Nigeria. The diaspora in Nigeria sends over 24 billion in remittances a year. So if you can imagine how much of the financing of the NSAS movement in Nigeria came from the diaspora. So that's very important. And yet, in Africa's most popular nation like Nigeria, the diaspora cannot vote. So this is where I say it's a two-way street, because the US can also push the Nigerian government to make sure that we open up the space, because there are more Nigerians overseas than in some of the states in Africa, as we all know. So it's a two-way street. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I now recognize Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just ask a couple of things. Some of my earlier questions, we did run out of time in terms of the answers. Mr. Dizolele, maybe you might want to speak to Somaliland, whether or not IRI and NDI is getting the support of the U.S. government to deploy your individuals to do election monitoring and the like. Let me also, on the issue of China, I have been raising human rights issues vis-a-vis China since before Tiananmen Square. We have seen the Chinese Communist Party double down, get worse by the day. And what the Chinese government is doing to the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang is a genocide happening right before our eyes. What they're doing to the Hong Kongers is a total violation of their word, and they are destroying democracy as it existed, fragile as it is in Hong Kong. My big concern over the malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party is its outsized influence it could have on a developing democracy. There are individuals who might be tempted to realize that with the Chinese support comes the security apparatus, the surveillance state, which they have perfected like nowhere else in the world. And I'm just wondering, if you look at a couple of years from now, where you see these tremendous countries that want democracy and want it badly going, with the Chinese government pushing so hard. I mean, I've chaired hearings on the Confucius Institutes and their influence on young people, the lies that are fed, including in our own higher education universities and colleges here in the United States. So the question about this influence of the Chinese Communist Party, they have no Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as we know. So therefore, in the business arena, they can bribe all they want. We don't do that, or we can't do it. It's illegal, and it should be. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to, how do we counter this malign influence that is so ever present and growing in its focus? Because we know, the intentions, or we think we know the intentions of Xi Jinping. It's not just China. It's not just the ASEAN countries in the region. It is beyond that. And Africa is right in the crosshairs of where they want to get or fleece African countries of their their minerals, of their oil, and the like. And so if you could speak to those issues, I would deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. IRI recognized the importance of Somaliland holding parliamentary and local elections. But since COVID-19 began spreading throughout Africa, in our case at IRI and our partner, we've shifted undertaking election observation virtually just because of the situation. But then also in the case of Somaliland, it's very complicated because we're not sure if the architecture, the internet architecture exists that can support such virtual observation. But this is an area that we remain interested in, along with Somalia. We have a strong presence in Somalia, helping political parties there. So Somaliland is something is on the radar, but the current situation makes it quite difficult, sir. As for the Chinese influence and the Malayan influence, I think the support that the governments of the United States and Congress has given implemental groups like IRI, NDI, and others remain crucial in combating that influence. And the most effective way to combat that influence is by supporting civil society organizations in countries that are most affected. Let me just give you a quick example. Even a small country like the Gambia, which is, by the way, very young, they were able to topple a dictator. We are now working with them in bringing about fiscal transparency, the transparent management of natural resources. Equipped with the skills, both the parliament and civil society can work together in stemming the flow of some of those issues that you've just raised.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Time permits. Anybody else want to comment?
I will just add a small note to what my colleague has shared, that we do, as NDI, are closely following what is going on in both Somalia and Somaliland, but we're not present there now. And then on the Chinese question, I do think that recognizing the specific nuances on the continent of Africa will be very important. And so an approach that focuses on empowering Africans to defend their own interests in their foreign relations, including economic, I think is one that must be prioritized. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Wonderful. I now
Chair.
Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this question is for all of the panelists. So much of today's hearing has been focused on countries who are exhibiting democratic backsliding and who we're very concerned about. But I wanted to spend a moment on some of the success stories that we've seen across the continent. For instance, in Malawi, in my opinion, the judiciary exercised real independence. And as a result, the opposition was actually able to win an election. Much of my background has been working in Ghana, which we know has had a series of successful elections. So I was wondering what lessons you think we can learn from some of these countries that have been able to have successful, legitimate, mostly peaceful elections that we can use for other countries as we engage with them.
Let me start. Malawi happens to fall in the region that I'm responsible for. And one of the beauties about Malawi is not just the transition, but the positive example it set for a region that had a series of problematic elections. So from sort of a broad 30,000 feet view, one of our approaches then is to see how we can support Malawi to consolidate those particular changes through support for executive transition programs, through working with parliament and through working with young people and all the political parties, and then using this to sort of showcase a model, a beacon of democratic consolidation within the region. But we are very excited about that. It reflects some of the key ingredients that really demonstrate that it's not just about elections. It's about countervailing power. It's about constraining power through checks and balances. It's about a strong judiciary and active civil society and engaged citizenry and other institutions that can help undergird democracy. I thank you.
Just to add, Congresswoman, on Malawi also, because in Africa, in the US and elsewhere, this, as you rightly pointed out, focus on what is going wrong. And we see that the Malawi example is the second on the continent, at least that I'm aware of. I'm an economist, I'm not an election expert, but Kenya, if you remember what happened in Kenya. And these good practices need to be really showcased. And in the case of Malawi, we actually had His Excellency Lazarus Chakwera write for us at Brookings in our flagship report, Foresight Africa. You'll find that one of the viewpoints there was expressed by him on essentially what happened in Malawi. So the Malawi example and the Kenyan example, what is the message for the United States administration and Congress? I think the idea of a race to the top is important. Can we create a vehicle whereby these types of countries, their civil societies, the youth, everybody, there are some new nomenclature, so they are rewarded, so that we can then push the agenda positively towards such countries that are racing to the top. You know, versus Museveni, for example, in Uganda, as Dickson will correct, you know, the millions of checks written yearly, and then, you know, basically, in other words, an alternative vehicle to recognize good practice may not be a bad thing, especially in the light of the current dispensation of President Biden-Harris. Thank you.
Do we still have a couple minutes, Congresswoman Jacobs, that I can chip in?
Yes, please.
All right. Yeah, thank you for your question, Congresswoman Jacobs. I think we often present these challenges as we did today, and then sometimes it overshadows and we say everything went wrong. But what I find really heartening and encouraging is even the cases where we say things are challenging, even like Uganda or Nigeria or DRC, there are tremendous number of success stories in those countries. Those DRC, I think President Kabila was finally able to leave, and he left because the people of Congo, civil society and political party and diaspora came together and made it happen. So this may reflect to what Dr. Ordu was saying earlier at the beginning of this setting, that sometimes we fail to measure the progress. I often tell young people, you need to see where we were last year or the cycle before, and then you see we do actually a lot of progress. So much that even people in places like Malawi and people like places like Botswana or Ghana have a lot to learn from the Nigerians, from the Ugandans, from the Congolese. Because after all, Bobi Wine's party won quite a bit of seats. He may not have won the presidency, but that itself is inching forward.
The time has expired.
Thank you very much.
I now recognize Member Kim.
Oh, thank you very much. Before the end of our first round of questioning, Representative Amibera mentioned engaging our youth as the future leaders who, I mean, I totally agree with what he mentioned, as they are the future leaders in ways as important as election integrity in Africa. And he mentioned, I believe, Youth Africa Initiative, which I agree with. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Omondi, can you identify or what are other ways that we can engage youth in Africa, either through your organization or through USAID or through Department of State programs? And then just in case we run out of time, I would like to pose the next question to Mr. Dizolele. If you can please assess which multilateral organizations have most effectively supported democracy and election security in the region? Specifically, how can we work more closely with the African Union to support the election integrity?
Thank you. On behalf of the youth in Africa, let me refresh by saying that the youth are future leaders, but they also see the urgency of now. So they also insist that really all these things must happen now, because we are always told about a tomorrow that never comes. I think there are excellent opportunities to engage with young people in the context of leadership development. And that is one of the things that NDI has been really focused on across the continent. And going back to Malawi, where we are also working with youth in civil society, and not just in political parties, to prepare them to be leaders and to take on more substantive responsibilities in their own democracies in their own countries. And we receive excellent support from USAID, from the National Endowment for Democracy, and from the Bureau on Democracy, Human Rights and Labor State Department, which we appreciate. Youth economic empowerment is also very important. A lot of young people will tell you about the challenges they are facing trying to get into the job market because of economies that have hardly expanded. So any efforts that are done around youth economic empowerment are important, and empowering them with job skills through technical vocational training that can allow them to also do some things that they will not do in white-collar jobs. So I will stop there and yield to my colleague.
Congresswoman Kim, when it comes to multilateral, there are not a lot of organizations that we can rely on, but a couple of them that I think are worth mentioning. One is ECOWAS, which until recently was a very progressive, very successful and effective organization. ECOWAS is the economic community of West African states. And what that REC did, as we call them, was embrace the charter of the region when it came to democracy. So it's ECOWAS that pushed a bunch of want-to-be dictators or dictators out. So Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia, ECOWAS weighed heavily so Yahya Jammeh can vacate after he lost the election. We saw a tentative of a coup in Burkina Faso with General Gendere. Again, ECOWAS said, not on our watch, you have to go. So organizations like that, where there is already a track record, we should be at the US government and Congress and other institutions should engage with them. They've backslid a bit lately in the case of Ghana, in the case of Guinea, and in the case of Cote d'Ivoire. But I think there is a lot there that we can go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Madam Vice Chair?
Madam Chair, I think you're it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Let me thank our witnesses, but before I gavel us out to adjourn, I wanted to ask each of you if you had any closing comments. Maybe you could each take 2 minutes, and I would ask Naomi if she could recalibrate the clock for 2-minute responses to sum up from each of our witnesses, and then we will conclude. Hold on 1 second while that 5 turns to 2. Maybe that 5 is not going to turn to 2. I'll just take time myself. Go right ahead. Our first witness.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, Madam Chair. I think very, very quickly, infrastructure is Africa's biggest challenge. And bringing infrastructure projects to bankability is a place that the US is absent. So if there was a way the United States with all its agencies can focus on working with African institutions like the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa to bring projects to bankability, that would be fantastically important, because without infrastructure, many of the things we're talking about now will not necessarily happen. What is the relationship with election? It has everything to do with it, because infrastructure is the key to improving the livelihoods of the people of our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to have to keep time myself, but that was absolutely perfect. Ms. Darnal.
Thank you, Representative Bass. So for my closing remarks, I would urge to see Africa beyond only the security challenges that we have focused on today, and beyond also the competition with China. I would also urge to see that Africa is more than the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, which I know represents important security interest for the United States and its allies. Just coming back to a point that Representative Omar said and one of Representative Jacob's question earlier, I think it is also important to reevaluate and really assess carefully and regularly the impact of security assistance whether it actually brings positive results or has negative impact. I'm thinking, for examples, or of contexts in which security assistance to security forces were linked after that to abuse of violence by the same forces. Also, to answer to Representative Jacob's question earlier about ways to continue to help responding before to electoral violence before it happens, I think it is important to look at funding NGOs, and in particular local NGOs. The competition around funding is fierce between international NGOs and local NGOs, and more asking for their own share. And I think this is only rightfully from them. It's important to support them, to build their capacity, support journalists, support projects that are built by local actors and that are meant to address local issues as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Omondi?
Thank you again, Chairwoman Bass. I think that as we reflect on the opportunities going forward, one of the things we must really look at is the ability of the US to take the advantage of the moment, to put democracy firmly on the table in their relations with African governments, African civil society, Africa youth and women. This is something that I think I hear a demand for, that we need to deepen relationships, trade, economic and otherwise, but democracy must be firmly on the table. And I think that would be very welcome from the perspective of the continent. To counter some of the democratic decline, authoritarian trends, Chinese malign influence as well as Russian malign influence, I think the strategy should really be about helping Africans, to empowering Africans to be able to defend their own interests. That to me is very important, and I urge the US and the allies to keep engaged and to sustain the engagement with African countries, Madam Chair. I thank you.
And thank you very much. Finally, Mr. Dizolele.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think for us and for Africa is often viewed from the United States through the binary prism of security or democracy, when in fact both are one and the same, just different coin, a different side of the same coin. So I will urge the United States to continue to prioritize support for political participation and processes that enable free, fair, and credible election. Those are very important. But also United States support remains critical to reinforce governance processes and sustain the independence of institutions, which has seen an erosion by corrupt government officials and authoritarian regimes. But finally, strong independent media are the bulwark against malign influence, including pro-Beijing and Russia and others. So I will say that we need to increase, the United States needs to increase its engagement in those spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me thank all of the witnesses today. And I want to take to heart what you said. Dr. Ordu, you talked about infrastructure. We are very, very, very committed to not just looking at Africa through the prism of security and China. And I often say when people are critical of China, and I am too, but to me, our role is to have the United States step up. And so in this committee, infrastructure is a key issue. But one of the things that you could do would be to give us specifics that can be legislative proposals or appropriation proposals in terms of resources. Where should resources be targeted? That would be very, very helpful. And in terms of engaging with the regional economic communities, and I would say this across the board to all of you, to the extent that you can give us very specific ideas of what legislatively would be helpful to helping the regional economic communities, to helping democracy will be very, very important. And in terms of Africa, being able to support Africa defending its own interest itself, please very specific so that we can then go from this hearing and propose specific legislative ideas. Feel free to get back to the staff in writing what your ideas are. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to staying in contact with you. And then most importantly, when our lives are back to normal, I look forward to going and participating with NDI and IRI again on election observation. That is such a rich, valuable experience. And frankly, I think the world has seen that we have challenges within our own democracy. The battle for the right to vote continues until this day, making sure that everybody in the United States that is eligible to vote, that wants to vote, can vote freely and easily. And so I am hoping that what the African countries can learn from us is that we have weaknesses in our democracy, but yet in the United States, we can openly challenge those weaknesses. We can make proposals. We can fight it out in terms of court or legislatively, peacefully always. And I, again, just want to thank you for taking the time out to be with us today. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.